We are Westchester Talk Radio.
State with Leah Caro. I, of course, am Leah Caro, president at Park Sterling Realty, headquartered in beautiful Bronxville Village, serving Westchester, Putnam, and Bronx counties. We have taken the show on the road and are broadcasting today from G. Griffin Wine and Spirits on Forest Avenue in Rye, New York, my favorite wine and spirit shop. We did just speak to Doug Caloris, owner and proprietor, comedian, and and Chops Buster, we'll call it that, who actually gave us some great information, a little history of wine, what to serve at Thanksgiving, plus why his company is different, and it's all about the service, folks. So as he would say, don't settle for bad service. Now I'm going to segue over. Back in June, a sweeping new law went into effect nearly overnight, and one of the first voices to start the conversation about what it means to tenants and landlords and realtors and consumers was James Dibbini. James Dibbini is a working attorney and proprietor at James D. Dibbini and Associates in Yonkers, and Jim and his associates handle every aspect of real estate law, including zoning and tax grievances and, of course, real estate closings, and they are experts in handling tenant-landlord law. And since the new law went into effect this summer, it feels like Jim has spent hours and hours presenting information about the new law to myriad different groups. So I could not be more delighted that he has taken time out of his super busy day and schedule to come to Westchester Talk Radio, Talking Real Estate with Leah, to talk about this new law. So, Jim, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Leah. It's a pleasure to be here, and really enjoyed the show. Doug is hilarious, and
he's something else.
Yeah, and the wine and spirits place you guys have here is amazing. It's just he's packing up a box of booze for me now, so my office will be happy to hear that. Going back with some good bourbon.
Excellent. So before we get into the new law, tell me, I know it's talked a little bit about your company, but tell me what I missed.
Sure.
Let everybody know.
I've been practicing 21 years. I got into this after a former CPA. I focus on real estate transactional work. That could be residential, commercial. As you had referenced earlier, 4-family, 5-family, and below is probably not considered commercial. And I also do a lot of civil litigation, so we're in Supreme Court on commercial contract, breach of contract matters on a daily basis throughout Westchester and the boroughs. We're in the Supreme Courts in those areas, as well as the local courts on landlord-tenant matters. But we are very heavily into the real estate transactional side, helping represent clients both on the buying and the selling, whether it's a co-op condo, house, multifamily house, commercial properties, warehouses, businesses, franchises. So we're heavily involved in that aspect of.
And you do tax grievance work as well, or somebody in your firm does?
Yeah, we've tapered down on doing the tax grievance work. We're so overwhelmed with a lot of other things that we're doing.
Understood.
It's another specialty area that we don't really focus on right now.
Okay, understood. So we were talking right before we came on the air about the affordability factor in Westchester County and the city. We were talking about with rentals in particular, and in the years that I've been in real estate, which is a few. We've always kind of had this soft spot for tenants because they have been required over the years to produce first month's rent, last month's rent, 2 months security, pet security. They're going to pay a commission potentially, and the fees just stack on and add up. And all of a sudden, they're paying nearly a down payment in some instances on a property. And so I totally get that Westchester and New York State is an expensive place to live and call home. So in thinking about that, I get that that we need to cut the tenants a little bit of slack sometimes. Now that being said, back in June, New York State and the government here also took a look at affordability and realized that it's tough, right?
Right, sure.
And went a little overboard, as government can do.
And sweeping changes.
So what they did on June 14th, enacted a law that went into effect immediately.
Right. The Housing Stability Tenant Protection Act of 2019, for the most part, became effective on June 14th. And there were a few items that kicked in later in October 12th. But for the most part, as we sit here today doing this, everything is in effect.
Right. And what we have seen, and this is where I really want to get nitty-gritty with you, what we've seen is that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. intentions.
Yeah.
And so what started off as good intentions for helping the affordability crisis in New York has really some unintended consequences for landlords and owners of buildings, of commercial real estate buildings that we really need to address.
Yeah, there was a huge pendulum swing, and now it's become much more difficult for, property owners who could be mom and pop, owners who own 3, 4, 5, 6 family houses are now put in a very difficult position where they purchased a property with a certain understanding of how could they afford the property and what the projected rent increases would be over the course of the years. And with this passage of the new law, it put a huge set of brakes on all of that. And, just for example, one example, if you have 6 units or more, those properties are typically, and if it was built before 1974, those properties were considered subject to rent stabilization. So this law that came out applies to both free market apartments, and houses. So it could apply to 1 family, 2 families, huge co-ops in Manhattan to, $20,000 or $30,000 a month rentals in Rye or Bronxville or Scarsdale or wherever, Armonk. It applies across the board to all those housing and apartments that are rental. And so the rent stabilization law, which is 6 units or more, is hugely impacted by this new Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act. And one small example I'll give you is if you've got a tenant who's been living in an apartment for 30 years, and they vacate the apartment, and the tenant was paying, say, $500 a month. Under the new law, the most you could increase that rent after making an investment of $15,000 to make improvements to that apartment, the most you can increase that rent is $89.29. So that means that the new apartment would be renting for, when that tenant vacates, you renovate the apartment, you put it up for rental, instead of renting it for maybe $2,000, which may be the fair market value depending on where you are in Westchester County, that apartment by law can't be rented for anything more than $589.29.
And that's just, I think, probably crippling for landlords who are relying on future income to sustain their buildings.
Right. And for that apartment really was being subsidized by all the other apartments for many, many years. The heat, the utilities, the maintenance, the service, that cost far more than $500 a month. So that was being subsidized. So the intent, and when that owner bought that property, is someday that property would come back into inventory and the landlord would be able to renovate it and bring it to close to fair market value. Maybe not fair market value, but close to it. Under the new law, that's non-existent anymore. And it's become very devastating to landlords. And I could see it in my practice. As I mentioned, I do a fair amount of commercial transactional work. And commercial, I also refer to multifamily buildings. We have done very little transactions. There's very little sales going on right now. And in fact, prior to this law coming out, there was a lot of talk about it coming down the road. And savvy landlords realized, or potential investors realized, that this law may be pretty bad, but no one knew it was going to be this bad. But as a result, the market had really died 6 months prior to, or maybe 8 months prior to, the June 14th release of the new law.
So let's break it down a little bit and kind of start, because this is a lot to digest.
Sure.
So I guess starting with, let's kind of tell the tenants now what the law means to them and what their rights are and what
Sure.
they should be aware of.
Sure.
So if you're a tenant, and this could be if you're renting a single-family house, it could be if you're renting a condo or a co-op, or any portion of a multifamily house, right?
Yep.
The landlord can no longer charge any more, not a nickel more than 1 month security.
That's correct. So it would be the 1 month security and probably the first month's rent.
And they can't charge first and last.
Right. They can't do that. You can't take a pet fee. You can't take. You can't charge more than $20 for a credit check.
And does the credit check include a background check?
You can't charge more than $20
for any sort of screening tool.
Yeah, so the landlord has to absorb, or the realtor has to absorb the rest of the cost. The tenant's exposure is only $20. If in fact the tenant shows up, or the prospective tenant shows up and says, "Here, I have a credit check that was done within 30 days," you have to accept that.
So if I walk in with my Credit Karma credit check,
Yep.
and it's less than 30 days old, you have to accept it?
You have to accept it. In other words, you can't charge them the 20, but if you choose to go ahead and do a credit check on your own, I think you still will be able to do that under the law. And the reality is that this law is brand new, and there's still a lot of gray area as to how it's going to be enforced, and it's going to take years before cases come down that further define or explain or clarify the true intent of the legislators when this law was passed.
And in fact, one of the gray areas that we deal with as realtors, and in fact with our consumers, is when you are renting a co-op or condo or any larger building that has a management company associated with it. Management companies charge substantial fees for applications frequently.
That's how they make their
2,
money.
3, 4, of course, and that's how they pay their staff and run the paperwork and all of that. And I appreciate that, actually. I run a business; they run a business. And the question was, can management companies charge application fees? Because what they're arguing is, well, I'm not the landlord. I've been paid to, and so that is one of the gray areas that I know that I haven't gotten a clear-cut answer on.
Right, and under the original law, which came out June 14th, they did not have the right to do anything other than charge to $20. And then management companies were working on trying other ways to enforce collecting payments, whether that's through increased other fees that they'd be charging.
I imagine they'll pass it forward to the landlord,
right? Exactly,
or the building,
right? But it's my understanding. I think about a month ago, they modified that aspect of the law because they realized your point, and that's management companies, were not the landlords per se, and co-op businesses is always a huge aspect of it, and the costs are really more than just the $20 for a credit check. So they did accept that aspect of it with respect to co-ops. So
good to know.
Some of the laws that are in the law have been rolled back as a result of the latest change.
So if you're a tenant, you should be aware that your landlord can now, a new landlord, new tenant, can only charge you 1 month security. They can't charge you first and last. They cannot charge you more than $20 for a credit or background check. They can't charge you an additional pet policy. So those are some good reforms for tenants, because affordability is tough. But
here's the playback. Here's the offset with that.
Yeah, go ahead.
So in the past, you would have a tenant who maybe his credit was on the fence, and landlords were like, you seem like a nice person, but your credit is horrible. I'll let you come in if you pay 3 months security. And the tenant would, some tenants would say, well, if you've got the money, yeah, that's great. I want this place really badly.
Because it's a great compromise as opposed to being told no.
Right, exactly. So now I think what some landlords are faced with is an automatic no because you don't make the threshold for the credit. And now so maybe the backlash is that now the tenant doesn't get that apartment where otherwise there were some options. And now there's no option.
And it's fine, even to take that one step further, I understand that if the tenant says, I know I have terrible credit, I'm offering to pay you 2 or 3 or 4 months in advance rent or in extra security, that the landlord can't take it even if it's offered and not asked.
That's correct.
Right, and so one of the unintended consequences is that landlords who would like to work with tenants maybe who are on the fence are now being really not given the ability to, and so we're still not housing a tenant.
Exactly.
And that's one of the... So that is kind of all of the stuff, or not all, some of the stuff that affects kind of that 4-unit and under buildings or single-family houses. Yeah. The landscape at 5 units and above has changed even more drastically.
Right. Well, 5, I think, as your earlier speaker today, Kevin, was talking about, for 5 units and above, that puts it into a category of commercial from a mortgage standpoint. But from a real estate legal standpoint, it's 6 units and above puts it into a category of rent stabilized. And it's the rent stabilized buildings that are treated differently than the fair market apartments. A lot of the laws are similar in terms of deposits and security deposits and so forth, but there's a lot more restrictions that are applied to the rent stabilization in terms of rates of increase in rents and what you could charge an apartment after a tenant vacates, and what you could try to recoup in improvements that you make to an apartment.
So here's some questions I have for you, and I'd like to approach it as I'm a investor, and because we do commercial real estate at Park Sterling Realty, and we get calls from folks who are interested in buying 10, 12, 20-unit buildings. So I want to talk investor buyers. I want to talk about people who currently own them and are planning to hold on to them and what they need to know, and then folks who maybe own them and are thinking maybe now is the time to sell. So let's start, I guess, with the middle group. I'm owner of a 9, 10, 12-unit apartment building.
Yep.
Let's call it Yonkers, maybe. In Down County, we get a lot of folks who want to, and there's plenty of inventory, and those buildings exist.
Right.
What does this new law mean to them, about improving their building or the units or anything like that?
Very, very good question. I think from a purchase aspect, you no longer can just take a building and say, okay, I'm gonna pay $125,000 a door, or I'm going to pay 8, 9, 10 times the rent roll for a property. Now you have to dive down deep into the numbers, the documentation, the registrations for the apartments, because each apartment must be registered yearly.
Registered with whom?
With the Department of Housing and Community Renewal. It's a state organization, and it's for short, it's DHCR. And if you don't register yearly, then you have a problem. And so if you're a buyer looking to invest in a property, instead of just taking these general numbers, 125,000 a door or 10 times the rent roll, now you really have to dive down and understand what, was the property properly maintained in the past? Is all the documentation in good order? Have the registrations been done? Will you be able to fight an audit or a subpoena from DHCR if it turns out they dispute what the rent being charged for a particular apartment? So you have to be much, much more careful. If you're an investor, you have to be more savvy. If you're relying on your attorney, you have to have an attorney who's just not a residential real estate attorney, because he will not understand the complexities of a commercial closing when you have to dive in and do the due diligence. And if you're being retained to do the due diligence, then you really have to understand the way this new law works.
And I couldn't agree more. Just as Kevin is a terrific residential mortgage lender, he knows that he's got connections in the commercial world, but that's not his thing. And when we talk to folks who are exploring commercial real estate, we say you can't work with a residential real estate attorney. It's just not the same animal, and they really have to know what they're doing.
Yeah, some do both, but some don't. Most don't, I think. And that's where the investor gets into trouble, because they're not aware of what ETPA means, the Emergency Tenant Protection Act, and they're not aware of apartments being registered, requirement for it being registered every year. And I have some clients come to me, they walk in the door and say, hey, I've got this building, I've owned it for a couple of years, and someone told me I just got this overcharge complaint from the Division of Housing Community Renewal. What does this mean? What it means is that there are mistakes made along the way, and now you're going to have to reconcile with them. And it usually means paying back tenants a significant amount of money, thousands and thousands of dollars, and what's possible rent overcharges. Any rent that's not registered is an illegal rent.
So if I'm a family and I've owned we've owned a 6-unit apartment building for generations, because that's how we maybe we emigrated to the United States, and it was one of our first. We all pooled our money and bought this, and it's been and that's how wealth is built in the United States. Of course. How is all this crazy new information being conveyed to me? Well, I'm not I don't own a 400-unit building. I own a 6-unit building.
That's a good question. I put out a newsletter every month or so to my clients and also prospective clients and vendors and referral sources.
Realtors.
Realtors.
I'm on your mailing list.
Awesome. Well, there you go. So I educate you on these new laws, but believe it or not, a lot of people still don't read it, don't understand it, I wish they'd pick up the phone and ask the question or shoot an email back and say, hey, what do I need to be doing here? Because you could avoid a whole lot of problems down the road if you address them earlier on.
Now, there's a couple of couple of acronyms. Yes. There we go. We are drinking wine here at G. Griffin today.
We have to slow down the wine.
Thanks,
Doug.
acronyms.
Appreciate the wine.
That I've been hearing about that have to do with improving a building and or improving individual units and how much I can recoup. Yeah. And there's like an MCI and can you talk about that?
Sure, I can. So MCI stands for Major Capital Improvement, and those are improvements made to the entire building. For example, a new roof, new windows, new driveway, new courtyards, new boiler. Those are considered MCIs, major capital improvements. In the past, you were able to, improve whatever you wanted to. Submit an application or a petition to the application to DHCR, the Division of Housing Community Renewal, and they would evaluate it, and then they would determine how much of an increase in rent would be applied to each tenant going forward.
Because they all benefit from the major capital improvement.
And so there was an incentive for the landlord to make those improvements. The new law now created a disincentive for the landlord to do that, because now the landlord initially under the old law would make that investment, and then with the understanding that they would be able to recoup that over the next 10, 15 years, they made that they would go forward and try to beautify the property.
Which seems really reasonable.
Yeah, it does. Under the new law, unfortunately, the max that you could do is a 2% increase across the board. And believe it or not, after 30 years, you have to roll back that increase. You have to roll it back. So whatever increase, if there was, say, a $10, $20 increase to that tenant's apartment on a monthly basis, after 30 years, you have to document and track all that stuff. And after that time, you've got to go back to that tenant and say, okay, now your rent is being rolled back by that increase that we took 20, 30 years ago.
So would it be fair to say that one of the unintended consequences of this new law would be that building owners might be less inclined to maintain their buildings because they're not going to be able to recoup their costs?
That's 100% accurate. It's not an inclination in the sense that, they just don't want to.
That's what I mean. It's a business. I mean, hey, there's only so much money to go around.
Exactly. I mean, the money comes in and the money goes out. So if there's money coming in to pay for major capital improvements, then it'll be done. If there's no money coming in to pay for them, then it would be foolish to make those expenditures with the knowledge that it could bankrupt you down the road. The same thing applies to the individual apartment improvements that you were alluding to earlier. And so separate from the MCIs, which the major capital improvements, which apply to the building-wide systems, the IAIs, the individual apartment improvements, are improvements done to an apartment after a tenant vacates. And I was mentioning that earlier, that under the new law, the most you can invest is $15,000, and the most you'd be able to add on to the rent would be $89.29 if you invest.
So I can't spend more than $15,000 and recoup it for each apartment.
You can, but again, there's a disincentive too. So it'd make no sense for a landlord to spend more than $15,000 if they're not going to be able to get some of that back over the course of the years. Now, under the new law, you have to divide that $15,000 by 168. So it's going to take you around 14 years or so to recoup that. Under the old law, you would divide it by 40. So the payback period was a lot quicker, and there was no limitation. So if you take a 3-bedroom apartment and you want to gut the kitchen, gut the bathroom, gut the apartment, put new sheetrock and new electrical and new plumbing, it's going to cost you way more than $15,000.
For sure, right.
So, but the legislators didn't take that into account. They assumed that, whether it's a studio or a 3-bedroom apartment, $15,000 is enough. It's not, and it's going to create a problem with.
And that is, and I think I'm a big housing advocate.
Sure.
That I'm chair WRO, which is a housing organization. So, for as much as I do appreciate the kind of the intent behind this law, these unintended consequences are what worry me, because now I know that really good people who own multifamily housing and big commercial multifamily housing with the best of intentions are not. It's not an issue, like you said, of wanting to improve their buildings. It's just the financial capability is just not going to be there. So instead of giving people good affordable housing, what we're doing is we're going to make it harder to get housing, and I think they're going in that the housing stock itself physically is going to suffer.
The quality of the stock you're not going to see suffer today, but in the next few years you're going to see it suffer. And maybe you not personally, because you're not walking inside the apartments, but the rents will clearly the rents will be coming down, but in conjunction with the rents coming down is the quality of the apartment stock going down, and that's the part that's sad.
So when you say rents are going down, because we've been talking a lot over the last 18 months of the show of what the cost of real estate and cost of rentals and housing and things, and rentals have been steadily going up. Yeah. Would you be saying that all rentals will continue to go up or come down, or just the ones that are in the large multifamily units?
I think you hit the nail on the head. I think your analysis and the reports that you speak about are for the 4 or 5 units and below, and they're not subject to rent stabilization. So if you have a 4 or 5 unit house and a tenant vacates, you could do whatever work you want to do to the apartment. There's no rent regulations. You could make any improvements you want or not, and you could charge whatever you want or not. Whatever the market will bear is what you could charge for rent. So, and more importantly, the reason I think why those rents are going up and why the price and why the sales are going up is because people are now disincentivized in buying multifamily units that are subject to rent stabilization. So that means if it's 6 units or more, and if you're a buyer, first-time investor, and you're on the fence about buying a 6 or 7 or 8 family building, and now you see that the new law creates a problem for you to buy that, it's going to push them to buy something in the 4 and 5 unit size, and that's why I think that market has been boosted up quite a bit, because there's a lot more buyers chasing those properties that would normally be in the market buying larger unit buildings.
Now, and that's a great observation, because as we were saying earlier in the show, the highest performing segment of the market in the last year is the 2 to 4 family unit, or 2 to 5 for your world family units, and that just inventory is down, prices are going really high, and that we're bringing them on and we can't sell them fast. We can't bring them on fast enough, and that's a really good observation. It's a great observation about these people who are maybe, because we do get calls from people who want to build their wealth through real estate, and look, historically, real estate's a great place to build wealth, no doubt about it. But that instead of that 8 or exactly, but instead of that 8 or 10 unit, kind of that entry level size multifamily commercial property, the new law is just restricting their ability to grow their wealth, and that also, the smaller properties are going to boom even more.
Sure, and it's not going to be as easy to get the loans that were readily available in the past, because now banks are faced with the same analysis. Are they going to?
Let's talk about that. Actually,
Sure.
That's important, because people, I think, not everybody's a cash buyer.
Right. Most people are.
Most people are not. Right. And I know that when we had Kevin on, he was talking about, and Kevin is a residential lender,
Right.
specializes in 4 and below. And that once you hit the 5, at least in the lending world, the 5 and up is where it becomes a commercial loan. So, yeah, let's talk about that.
Well, my experience is that, and speaking with commercial lenders myself, is that the banks had to change their analysis on how they figure out how they're going to lend money, and what was in the past. Analysis that whatever the rents are today, they're going to go up at some significant percentage year after year.
Ideally.
Based on the old law.
Or some steady percentage even.
Yeah, exactly.
Like up.
But now banks are looking at that differently, if my understanding is speaking with brokers, mortgage brokers, and they're telling me that now they've recalibrated their analysis, and as a result, there's less money to lend on these transactions going forward.
Is it because they don't believe that the income will be going up as steadily or at all? Or
they factored in the new law in the sense that they realized that what was going to be a steady increase is now longer. I'm not sure whether their analysis is now flat or whether it's a 1% or 2% increase year to year. I'm not really sure about that, but I could tell you that they've had to reanalyze it. I've had a lot of brokers speak to over the phone, and they were trying to figure out how they're going to reanalyze their portfolios and how they analyze doing loans in the future. So I know there were some changes.
And that's really tough because, again, build wealth, right, through real estate. And nothing goes down in cost. I mean, right? And Westchester County is a beautiful place to live. I wouldn't live anywhere else,
Sure.
But it's an expensive little place to live. And so I know that just costs associated with maintaining a home, is heck, I'm about to do a bathroom at my house. So just doing any work, that cost doesn't go down.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. So now that the rents are capped, but the expenses continue to go up and up and up, it gets to a point where the margins get smaller and smaller and smaller
Until they're non-existent.
Until they're non-existent, and then the question becomes, what am I doing here? Why am I just scraping by to try to collect some rents to put it back into taxes, utilities, oil,
and taxes are certainly not going down.
No, and water. So all the expenses are going up astronomically, and without there being some kind of match with an offset with revenue being increased, I think it's a matter of time where there's going to be some issues in the market.
So what are you foreseeing? Because let's face it, right? It's a double whammy. So costs, as we've just said, are definitely not going down. The potential for earnings is definitely going down.
Yep.
So look 2 years or a year. What is the future forecast? Is it 6 months? Is it 2 years? Is it 5 years? When do we think this significant impact is going to, or is it here already?
I think loans are coming due. Commercial loans are coming due. The typical commercial loan is 5-7 year maturity. In the past, in the last 20, 30 years, as far as I've been practicing, the logic is that you could do a 5-year loan, refinance the property in 5 years, pull more money out, and then reinvest
leverage it and go buy something else.
Leverage it, fix up the property or buy something else or do both. But that whole scheme has changed. So now in the past, where owners were okay with their loan coming due because they'd be able to pull some money out and make the improvements
because they had equity that grew.
Now there's no equity. In fact, across the board, as I speak to people in the industry, they're all of the consensus that the property values for commercial properties dropped 25% at least
since June, or just
since June. Yeah.
Wow.
Maybe earlier because it was already the
buzz.
They thought it was coming. Yes, but here's the reality. If you're a homeowner, if you're an investor and you want to buy a 6 or 10 family house and you bought one, say last year, and you paid just round numbers, $1 million, say $1 million, okay, and the bank is going to lend you 75%. So you have a $750,000 mortgage and you have $250,000 in equity. After this law came out, poof.
You have zero equity.
You have zero equity. So now they have nothing. They have nothing in the property. They own really. There's no equity. There's no asset.
Do you think we'll see foreclosures increase?
I would not be surprised if that comes down the road in the next year, 2 years, 3 years down the road, when people are forced to refinance the properties and they had they had lived a lifestyle where they thought they were going to be able to, make that improvement and take a little bit more money out to pay those investments. So if they made investments in the property and they was hoping that a refi would be able to pay down those costs of improvements to the property, it's going to present a problem.
For sure. Hey, you know what? We're going to take a quick break, but then I have a really good question for you when we come back. Hey, we're talking to Jim Dibbini, Dibbini and Associates, and this is Leah Caro, talking real estate with Leah Caro, broadcasting from
Pasquale Ristorante. Pasquale Ristorante. Pasquale Ristorante. Pasquale Ristorante from the heart of Italy.
Pasquale Ristorante is the perfect dining experience. Your favorite Italian comfort food plus the comforts of home away from home. Pasquale Ristorante has been treating you like family for nearly 20 years. And if you need catering, Pasquale will take care of it. Pasquale Ristorante, bringing family, friends, and food together.
Pasquale Ristorante treats you just like family. Pasquale Ristorante, an Italian specialty.
Pasquale Ristorante, 2 Putnam Avenue in Portchester. We're back. Westchester Talk Radio is broadcasting live.
Welcome back to Talking Real Estate with Leah Caro. I, of course, am Leah Caro, president at Park Sterling Realty, which is headquartered in beautiful Bronxville Village. We serve Westchester, Putnam, and Bronx counties. We are joined by Jim Dibbini of James Dibbini and Associates, law firm in Yonkers, New York, who has been giving us a really good in-depth analysis of the new tenant-landlord law that came into effect this past June and what it means to the real estate world. So welcome back, Jim.
Thank you.
When we left off, and I just want to segue real quick, is that if you didn't get to hear all of the previous hour or so, or if you've missed any of our previous shows, you can always go to westchesterrealestate.com, look at the Talking Real Estate with Leah Caro podcast, and choose by topic what you'd like to hear. Also, you can go to the iTunes store and download the app of Westchester Talk Radio. You can also check out my LinkedIn profile, Leah Caro. I have all my podcasts there as well, and our social media and stuff like that. Anyway, so Jim, we were talking about how the unintended consequences of what sounded like a great law to address affordability issues for tenants in Westchester County has gone a little haywire.
Right.
And that for the 5-unit and above owners, or 6, let's call it 6, because I know in the finance world it's 5, but in the legal world, for the law, it's 6.
Exactly.
And the 6-unit and above world, this law has really got some terrible consequences for owners who want to reinvest in their buildings and maybe someday sell their buildings, and what the financial impact will be to them.
Sure.
Here's my question to you. None of us have our magic 8 ball out. Actually, I do have a magic 8 ball in the car, but
you don't make your decisions based on that, do you?
It depends on the decision. You could ask Doug Caloris about that. Is there a point in the near future, far future, that it makes sense to be an investor in these type of properties, or is this market just kind of cooked for now?
Well, I think it's on a case-by-case basis. Each property has to be analyzed, and you really have to dive down in the documentation what the potential for the increase in revenue is going to be down the road. As I mentioned earlier, in the past you could just generalize, and people looked like brilliant investors by making purchases based on some summarizing numbers. Now you really have to dive down deep and really analyze this information. That's where a good realtor will come in handy and help you understand those numbers better. If
a good
you're
attorney
for the first time, and
an attorney who seriously, I cannot listen, folks. I cannot stress this enough. You've heard me say it when you come to me with your Uncle Sid, who does probate, and I say, no, you can't use him. You need a real estate attorney. If you're looking at commercial real estate, you cannot just use any old real estate attorney. You need a real estate attorney who works in the commercial sector.
And that's me, Jim Dibbini.
That is Jim Dibbini, and that's why I had Dibbini here today, because there's not a voice in Westchester right now who I think is being listened to more than yours when it comes to this new law, because you're really out there. So if So if I was someone who thought that I'm going to build my wealth based on real estate and multifamily housing, it used to be I would just look at the rent rolls and what does it cost to heat the place and what does it cost? It was very fairly simple analysis of rent versus expense, right?
Yep.
And that whole equation has changed.
Yep, it's gotten more complicated. You have to analyze what the current rents are, what the potential rents are going to be, what the likelihood of those apartments turning over, and if I don't want to get too complicated, but there's something different. There's two types of rents that are on record with the DHCR. One is called legal rent, and the other one's called preferential rent. So, and without boring your audience, if a good landlord has been managing the property, they're able to document a legal rent which is higher than what the tenant is actually paying, and when it turns out that tenant vacates under this new law, the landlord will be able to bring that rent up from what that tenant was paying to what's called the legal rent.
The legal rent is not market rent.
Correct. So the legal rent could be $2,000. The market rent could be, say, $1,500. And another name for that market rent may be considered preferential, but it may be lower than the market. But under the new law, when that tenant vacates, you would be able to bring the rent up to that legal rent. So it would eventually go up to that $2,000 number. That's the only still remaining potential to make a significant increase in rent if a landlord has been documenting the registered rent, has been putting it into the leases. If he's been doing everything proper, then he's able to do that. A lot of landlords, unfortunately, are not savvy and don't know what legal rent is and don't know what preferential rent is, and they do their own registrations and they just put in a number, and that's the number that this tenant is happened to pay at this particular time. I've seen these numbers bounce around on registrations that I represent clients for all the time, and there's no rhyme or reason. And those are the problemed properties that are going to have a devaluation in property by any savvy investor who analyzes these numbers and realizes we've got potential problems here. These are all time bombs waiting to explode once we buy the property.
So if I've been a good landlord in my 8-unit building, and I've treated my tenants well, I've maintained my building, but my paperwork, maybe not so much. Is it too late for me to get my act together?
No, it's not too late. It's not too late. You need to speak to somebody who knows what they're doing with rent stabilization law, such as a person like myself, and we sit down and go through all their rent rolls, go through the registrations, make a request for documentation from DHCR to see what's been done, how it's been filed, and then go through all the improvements that are made to the property and to the apartments, and work from there, and reestablishing and creating the registrations so that we could get the client's valuation back up for them.
And one other question: if I'm the landlord, do I want long leases right now?
Well, if it's rent stabilized, you have a choice of 1 or 2 years to offer the tenants. So it's not an option of 3 or 4 or 5. If it's fair market, which is 5 units or less, it depends. It depends on where you think the market's going. I'm not a big fan of leases longer than 2 years, but there may be some circumstances where that makes sense for the homeowner.
Right, and so looking out at the future, I don't want our segment to be all doom and gloom. I really don't, because I'm always looking for opportunity. First of all, sure. I do want tenants to know that they have some new good rights, which are important.
Without a doubt.
Without a doubt, which was, I think, the intention of the law that went horribly astray in the process. But I don't want to be too doom and gloom. So I'm wondering, is there any opportunity out there? Is there an upside to any of this?
I think it's going to have to play itself out over the next year or two. I think right now the sellers are still of the mindset that their property is worth pre-law change. So they're still the mindset, well, yeah, I want to sell my property, but I'm selling it for X. But the reality is it's no longer worth X because of this new law. And there's buyers out there who have money on the sidelines waiting to buy stuff, but in taking into consideration this new law, the property's just not worth the X that this seller is wanting for it. So I think as time goes on over the next year, I think when sellers have to sell, I think you're going to find these prices coming down to meet what the true new market value is, and buyers will start getting active again in the market.
So if I said, Jim, will you come back in 6 months and join us and let's see where we are and take
My
the market
pleasure.
temperature again? Would you do that for me?
100%.
Now, in the meantime, if I wanted to get in touch with you, where and how would I do that?
Sure. Well, my office number is 914-965-1011. The fastest way to probably get a hold of me is my email. It's jdibbini@dibbinilaw.com. That's JDIBBINI Dibbini, at dibbinilaw.com. I respond, almost 24/7. So that's probably the quickest way to get a response.
And you mentioned a mailing list, which I, by the way, am on.
Yes.
So I get your newsletters.
Yeah.
If I want to get on your newsletter, how do I do that?
Shoot me an email. Shoot me an email at jdibbini at dibbinilaw.com, and I'll quickly get you on the newsletter. And you'll stay abreast of the new changes. There are changes, amendments coming out to this law. So if you're a landlord of any size, whether it's one or two family or 20 or 30 or 50 unit, you're going to want to stay up to date on these new laws because it could affect your bottom line.
It absolutely will. And I just want you also to know that both Jim and I are both working really hard and talking to our legislators to get some amendments made or to see about getting some tweaks to this.
Sure.
And they want to hear, by the way, you can contact me, Leah Caro, or Caro at parksterlingrealty.com, or Jim. And let us know your true life anecdotes and stories. I have, as legislative chair of the Hudson Gateway Association of Realtors, we do have the ear of the politicians and the legislators and the elected officials who, they're always running for office, who want to know what the impact has been, and they need some true life anecdotes. They just don't want to hear just from us.
Yep, likewise. Send them on to me as well so that I can communicate them also.
Absolutely. So you've been listening to look, Matt's getting ready to play the music. Don't play that music yet, Matt. You've been listening to Talking Real Estate with Leah Caro. We have been broadcasting live from G. Griffin Wine and Spirits in Rye, New York, everybody's favorite wine and spirit store where service is number one and dogs are always welcome. Don't forget to stock up for your Thanksgiving needs. We'll see you on the radio next month. Bye.
Shark Creative. Get
Thank you, listener. Yes, Shark Creative is the company you think of for on-hold messages. If you want to hear how it helps, you can call Mercedes-Benz of New Rochelle, Durante Rentals, Michael Labriola Inc., Oak Ridge Staffing, Emma's Ale House, Northeast Environmental, or just go to sharkcreative.com and listen there. Meanwhile, we've expanded our services as your all-audio resource. On-hold messages, of course, production and placement of radio campaigns on the Pete and others too. And now we also have our very own internet radio station, Westchester Talk Radio. Look for us on Facebook at Westchester Talk. Have us come out to your next event, help you capture audio from your sponsors, associates, friends. Bite into that first impression with Shark Creative. Everything audio. It just sounds better.